My dear sisters and brothers, bishops, archbishops, both here in this hall and those joining us online, may I welcome you to this session, this plenary on interfaith. I know there is a little confusion, perhaps some typo. If you look at the program, it says 1 o'clock lunch, and the next is 4:15. But you good people of God, you are here. Thank you very much. And whichever way you look at the program, 2:30 to 3:45, forget about that 1 o'clock lunch, because there is no lunch after this, I'm afraid. But as we meet together, the Lord be with you. Friends, I'm Danald, Jute, the Bishop of Kuching in the province of Southeast Asia. And for the benefit of those who are not too familiar about the province or where my diocese is, my diocese covers the state of Sarawak in Malaysia, the Sultanate of Brunei Darussalam, which has Sharia law in place, and part of Kalimantan, Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country. It gives me a great pleasure as chairman of the Anglican Communion Interfaith Commission to share this plenary session on interfaith. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Dear God of all nations, we thank you for calling us and making us your own. Help us by your Spirit as we continue to seek to walk and work with all, above all with you, to the glory of your name. Amen. Bishops, archbishops, sisters and brothers, we are well aware that many of you here are giants in the field of interfaith. You have mountains of experiences and expertise as practitioners of interfaith. And for that, we can only give thanks and praise to God and ask that you will be generous enough in sharing your experience to encourage the whole communion in this important aspect of our ministry. Yet we are also aware that for some of us, perhaps the very mention of interfaith is not just viewed with suspicion, but a big no-no. But let us face it, as a communion, interfaith is not optional. Hence, we give thanks to God for its place here in this Lambeth Conference. In our world of diverse religions and none, it is imperative that we continue to ask together how we might be able to witness faithfully to the Lord Jesus Christ and his name, to build bridges, to walk and to work with others for the common good. Interfaith, let us also be clear, is never about watering down the gospel. Neither has it any intention of condemning others who are unlike ourselves. And so what is interfaith? This afternoon, we will be guided by our keynote speaker, and none other than Bishop Guli Francis-Dehqani from the Diocese of Chelmsford, as well as our panelists, Archbishop Linda Nicholls, the Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada, Bishop Joseph Wandera from the Diocese of Mumias in Kenya, the Reverend Lillian Taroy, who is a priest serving in the Diocese of Amritsar, India, as well as Archbishop Samy Fawzy, the Archbishop of Alexandria and Egypt. And so, friends, without further ado, I would like to invite now Bishop Gulli to share with us her keynote address. Bishop Gulli, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. It is very good to be here with you, and it goes without saying that it is, of course, a huge honor to address you in this plenary. The subject of interfaith relationships touches most, if not all of us, in some shape or form, because, as we've heard, we live in a pluralist society with people of all faiths and none. But our vastly varied contexts means that our thinking and our responses will probably be very different from one another. I speak out of my own particular context and experiences, which relate especially to Christian-Muslim relations. But I hope that some of the themes that I'm going to touch on will be helpful to others of you, if nothing else, to stimulate thinking and discussion. So let me begin, if I may, with a little bit about my own life story, so that you can place what I say within the context of my story. Although I'm now a bishop in the Church of England, I started life in Iran, where I was born and grew up. It was in the tiny Anglican community there that the seeds of my early faith were planted. My father was a Muslim convert from a small village in the center of the country. And by the time that I was born, he was already bishop of this fledgling diocese of Iran. And my mother, the daughter and granddaughter of British missionaries, was herself born and raised in Iran. So I lived an unusual life between and betwixt the worlds of Islam and Christianity, Persian and English, and Eastern and Western influences. This unusual childhood was what I considered normal. And for the most part, my two worlds of school and wider society on one hand, and home and church life on the other, coexisted reasonably peaceably, and there was some occasional overlap. But all of that changed as the events which led eventually to the Islamic Revolution of 1979 began to unfold. At school, I began to be ostracized, both by friends and by teachers. And at home, the church was coming under increasing pressure. Over a period of around 18 months, our institutions, such as hospitals and schools, were forcibly taken over or closed. Church offices and the bishop's house were ransacked, raided, and confiscated. The church's financial assets were frozen. One of our clergy was found murdered in his study. And my father was briefly imprisoned before an attack on his life, in which he survived, but my mother was injured. But for us as a family, events culminated in the murder of my brother in the spring of 1980, when he was 24 years old. His car was ambushed on his way back from work, and he was shot in the head, and he died instantly. My father was out of the country at the time for meetings, but although no one was ever brought to justice, we've always understood that my brother was targeted because of his association with the church and simply because he was his father's son. After the funeral, my mother and my sister and I joined my father here in England, assuming that we'd be back home within a few weeks or months. But of course, that was not to be. And so having arrived here originally as a refugee, aged 14, here I still am, over 40 years later now, and a British citizen. My father continued working as bishop in Iran in exile until his retirement, and he dedicated his life to supporting and encouraging Christians still in Iran and working with Persians, both Christian and Muslim, in this country. And in particular, he dedicated his time to writing and translating Christian literature in Persian. During his episcopate, he attended 3 Lambeth Conferences, but both my parents have now died, and the diocese in Iran is extremely isolated and currently without a bishop. So these formative experiences have shaped my thinking, and they continue to inform my understanding of how we as Christians engage with other faiths, especially when elements within those faiths wish us harm. It's not easy, and it hasn't been straightforward, but it's involved for me embracing the concept of paradox. That ability to hold together apparent contradictions to help us navigate the way faithfully through what is often rough terrain. For example, I have known Islam both as a great civilization, which over the centuries has gifted to the world some of the greatest scientific advances, architectural designs, poetic and literary masterpieces, and spiritual insights. The photo that you now see on your screen is the only one I have of me with my grandfather, a godly and wonderful Muslim man of deep faith. But I have also known Islam as a force which has done my family and the church in Iran great harm. It is difficult, but necessary somehow to hold both these threads together and to remember that the evils which have befallen the church are not a reflection on the whole Islamic faith. In the words of the late, great Kenneth Cragg, whilst certainly an Islam was guilty, nevertheless, the Islam that is indicated in what befell the Persian church might have stayed its hand by councils no less claiming its name. So, what impact has this way of thinking had on my encounters with Muslims in the West? Well, I try to see the best, to be respectful, to learn and understand more deeply. And alongside this, I've also sought to be honest, to tell the story of the church in Iran and to ask respectfully and gently if they are willing to condemn this element of their faith, even as we condemn the Christianity that fought the Crusades, for example, or which shows itself in some of the far-right politics of the Western world today. These are attempts to hold together in tension both the Christian call to forgiveness and to justice. And these are immense and complex themes which we don't have time to engage with further now. But let me just say that my story and experiences, indeed those of all of us, sit today within the context of the theme of this plenary, which is hospitality and generosity, and against the backdrop of today's Bible passage from 1 Peter chapter 4, which itself holds the importance of hospitality and generosity alongside the reality of suffering and persecution. It's important to note that Peter doesn't glorify suffering for its own sake, and neither does he suggest that it should be endured passively. Again, this relates to the call for Christians to act and speak for justice wherever and whenever possible. Nevertheless, Peter also reminds his small community that they shouldn't be surprised by the suffering that they're undergoing because Christ himself suffered. And in that sense, suffering is the default for any Christian community. Indeed, perhaps the norm for Christianity is that it should be persecuted, and we should be worried when we're not experiencing persecution. And Peter encourages his community and us to associate any suffering we undergo because of faith with the suffering of Christ, thereby finding comfort and even joy in its midst. In a mysterious way, suffering can take us closer to Christ. This is how my father described it at the height of the revolution in Iran. The way of the cross, he said, has suddenly become so meaningful that we have willingly walked in it with our Lord near us. Our numbers have become smaller, our earthly supports have gone, but we are learning the meaning of faith in new and deeper ways. So this is part of our thinking as Christians and should permeate our practice when we're seeking to relate to people of other faiths, even when they may be wishing us harm. The paradox is that whilst there is injustice which must be spoken out against, the suffering is also taking us closer to Christ and is part of our calling as people of faith. Put this then alongside the themes of hospitality and generosity, both in 1 Peter 4, but also in much developed Anglican theology around interfaith relations. And most especially, perhaps, in the document Generous Love that was endorsed by Lambeth 2008. Now, it is right to acknowledge that the proper reading of 1 Peter 4 relates more specifically to hospitality within the church family. And yet, there are many scriptural passages and theological traditions that help us expand this familial imperative to one that Christians, through the church, extend to the wider world. God's love and generous hospitality, demonstrated through the inner life of the Trinity, draws us in and sends us forth to do likewise. This is how generous love expresses it. And I quote, "Our pressing need to renew our relationships with people of different faiths must be grounded theologically in our understanding of the reality of the God who is Trinity. Father, Son, and Spirit abide in one another, in a life which is a dynamic, eternal, and unending movement of self-giving. In our meeting with people of different faiths, we are called to mirror, however imperfectly, this dynamic of sending and abiding. So our encounters lead us deeper into the very heart of God and strengthen our resolve for interfaith engagement." And this, of course, has resonances with Kenneth Cragg's life and work, in which he emphasized the need for Christians to learn to be both hosts and guests, with all the power imbalances and paradoxes which that involves. Cragg wrote, "We find ourselves guests at God's banquet. You spread a table for me," was how the psalmist saw it, speaking of the very landscape as a scene of hospitality. We then have a pattern of relating where the church can be both host and guest, shaped and embraced within the hospitality of the Godhead. The wide diversity of engagements with other religious traditions that are represented in this room will emphasize different elements of interfaith relations, including dialogue, work for the common good, witness, and evangelism. Each of you will have important insights that somehow need to be held in tension together for the fullest and richest understanding. For some, the priority will be dialogue, which seeks deeper understanding and works towards the common good. People of faith seeking peace and reconciliation and looking to make the world a better place. For others, this may be a far cry from your experiences. Under the Islam of present-day Iran, Persian Christians are guilty of apostasy, and their legal status as a church is unrecognized. So how can a body that doesn't even exist engage in dialogue? Christians are charged with the mission to share their faith with their neighbors. This means that they cannot be closed communities, but ones which reach outwards. But how to do this when you're in a minority who is fearful for your existence? Is it possible to dialogue with those who persecute you? Well, yes and no. If dialogue means conversation between equal partners based on mutual respect and understanding, then no. But if the urge to dialogue is a Christian impetus to be fully present and Christ-like, then yes. To have confidence in one's faith whilst continuing to try to understand the other more fully, that is a kind of dialogue. And when the situation arises, by offering the hand of friendship based on generosity and forgiveness, that too is dialogue in action. And it is the kind of dialogue that Anglicans in Iran have participated in for much of their history. In other contexts, there are possibilities to work collaboratively for areas of shared concern, for the common good, and for the peace of the world. The COVID pandemic, tackling climate change, and indeed the very cause of religious freedom can provide huge opportunities for partnerships across faith communities. These are valuable, and they should be pursued wherever possible. But to those who are fortunate enough in relative safety to be able to engage in such fruitful relationships, I would gently say, always remember your brothers and sisters around the world who are suffering persecution. Do not forget them, and do not be silent in the face of their reality. I'd like to share an excerpt in English translation from just one of the many letters that I've received over the years from Iranian Christians who are fearful and desperate. Having described his plight and that of his son, Ismail writes this: I am aghast at the community of Christians sitting on their hands, not raising a finger to act, but only observing and praying. They do not do anything in the face of the evil going on. They say there is nothing they can do apart from pray. The only sympathetic phrase we keep hearing is, "Oh dear, what a shame." On hearing our stories, such as those who are executed or imprisoned or tortured, they repeat the same phrase so often that it becomes normal. In the words of Scripture, their hearts are hardened. The hard-hearted ones who have been saved. This is no salvation. I don't want to judge, but the God who said, "I was sick and you did not visit me," is unlikely to thank them for failing to act. I feel helpless and powerless and impotent in response to this letter. What can I possibly say or do for Ismail? But I carry the letter around with me, and I share it when I can, as a constant reminder not to become immune to the suffering of others, even as my context in Britain allows me the freedom to build good relationships with Muslims and people of all faiths. And so what of witness and evangelism? This too is a Christian calling to be lived out graciously, gently, authentically, both in words and actions. And it has nothing, in my way of thinking, to do with standing on street corners and shouting Bible verses at passers-by. But it's about the forging of meaningful relationships that cultivate the possibility for sharing faith through deep and honest engagement. Again, context is everything. And so witness and evangelism will look different in different places, and in some parts of the world may not be possible in the way that we fully understand them. But let's be honest and admit that for many of us, in the West at least, the barriers are nothing to do with safety or fear of persecution, but more to do with our own embarrassment, our misplaced fear of offending others, and our lack of commitment in developing those deep relationships of trust. As I draw to a close, I want our final thought to be for those Christians who live as minorities in often hostile and dangerous environments. Many years ago now, I read an article by Bernhard Reitzmar, and it's called Strangers in the Light, and it's always remained with me. He suggests that there are generally two possibilities for those who are persecuted: to withdraw from the world or to fight for the right to ring the church bells, as he puts it, and live with the consequences. But neither approach, he suggests, is quite in keeping with the gospel. So what is the alternative? Surviving as a threatened minority, claims Reitzmar, is only possible in the context of a strong community. The challenge, then, is neither to fight nor to flee, but to build a vibrant, living, true community that becomes God's new society and seeks to engage with the world around it as best it can. In words from today's Bible passage, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 19, let those suffering in accordance with God's will entrust themselves to a faithful Creator while continuing to do good. Perhaps this is something we would all do well to remember and to live by, no matter what our context. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Bishop Gulli, for that very powerful, very insightful, yet extremely challenging message to us all. We have 4 panelists to respond and to share their stories from the 4 corners of the Anglican world. And we will begin in Africa. And for that, I would like to invite Bishop Wandera to share with us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having us all the way from the Diocese of Mumias, Kenya, to share our stories around engagement with peoples of other faiths. This afternoon's theme, we explore specific questions. How can we be a church that works together with sisters and brothers from other faiths? How can we learn from and engage in constructive dialogue? How might we cooperate in the common issues we face? And I speak from my context in a largely rural diocese of Mumias, where engagements with Muslims are shaped by historical but also contemporary paradigms. Mumias Diocese has one of the earliest encounters with Islam in the interior of Kenya. And this goes back into the 18th century, when Arab traders traveling from the coast of Mombasa on their way to Uganda paid homage to an African monarch at the time by the name Nabongo Mumia. The Arab traders knew that by paying homage, they would get protection. and that they probably would also get some slaves and ivory. And in turn, the king would get guns to fight off his enemies, particularly the Luo, who were quite vicious in fighting Nabongo Mumia. And in that context, therefore, the Arabs settled in Mumias and intermarried with local women. And this gave Islam a stronghold in Mumias, the diocese where I serve. Our context is one that 50% of the people around us are Muslims, and the remaining 50% are Christians. And yet God is calling us to serve in that specific context. And I really appreciate the speaker, the main speaker, that the way we respond is really shaped by our contexts. Now, my context is largely a peaceful one with Muslims, albeit with mutual suspicion from time to time and occasional violence. And how can we work together in that context? When I became bishop 5 years ago, one of the first things I did was to visit the local Jamia mosque in Mumias town and to be welcomed by the imam for a cup of coffee. It was on the day of Eid al-Fitr, the day of breaking the fast. And that has opened immense doors in terms of my ministry with and alongside my Muslim brothers and sisters in the context of Mumias. We continue to work with them. In the context of COVID-19, we had joint work of advocacy around safety and calling upon our Christian communities to wash their hands and to use masks in their marketplaces. And that has proved a very, very fruitful form of engagement with them. We have engaged in joint cleaning up exercises in our small city of Mumias. Muslim youth and Christian youth all joined together and cleaning our markets. In Eastleigh, Nairobi, where I served at St. Paul's University, I co-founded the Center for Christian-Muslim Relations in Eastleigh, an area that is largely occupied by Somali Muslims. And we had very productive engagements. Muslims, young people, and Christian young people going out into the streets to map Eastleigh and to come together and to share each other's stories of faith. The Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has warned us against the danger of one story, the danger of a single story. So I have shared with you the first story. The second story is that of mutual suspicion and conflict. The popular assumptions about Muslim politics as inflexible, authoritarian, and underachieving, and which, in a sense, is a global story about Islam and Muslims, and how this plays out in our local villages as they look at us as Christians. Kenya, where I come from, neighbors Somalia, and our story is a story of occupation in Somalia and many years of war. And Kenya and other Eastern African countries have suffered terror over the years. The American Embassy, Garissa University, the Jute attack, and in many, many other places. And all these happenings, both at the global scale and at the local scale, impact on how we relate with Muslims. And sometimes it makes it extremely difficult for us to be faithful witnesses of the story of Jesus in that context. Our story of conflict It's also a story of polemics, street preaching, and castigating what the other believes. In one particular case, a Seventh-day Adventist was preaching in the small town of Mumias, and he said something to the effect that the reason why Muslims don't eat pork is because when the Prophet Muhammad was buried, a pig went and unearthed his body and ate it. And when the Muslims in Mumias gathered at Jamia Mosque for their Friday Salah prayers, they say to each other, there's somebody in this town who is abusing us. Let us go and teach him a lesson. And they all marched towards the space where the preaching was taking place. One person was murdered, and Bibles were torn into pieces, and bicycles were similarly torn into pieces. So our story is also a story of some serious conflict, side by side with peaceful coexistence. In Kenya, xenophobia against Islam is manifested in many, many other ways, in our thoughts and ideas and expressions. Expressions such as Islamic courts can only serve to amputate hands of petty thieves. And this story is not just our story, it is an imagination that plays out in our global world. Prejudice has persistently contributed to historical antagonisms and animosity, making working together with Muslims in Mumias very, very difficult. And so we slip into a different mode of existence. We slip out of the mode of peaceful coexistence and harmony and sharing each other's story. We now slip into mutual distrust and protectionism. And so my invitation to each one of us here is to look at the possibilities, the positive possibilities around working and working together with Muslims. Because it is true, we want to tell the story of Jesus, but how can we tell it without building positive relations and friendships? Let us all look out for opportunities, for platforms, for spaces of extending generosity, as 1 Peter invites us. And in those spaces, we shall develop confidence in telling the amazing story of grace, how Jesus has saved us, and how he invites all others around us in the building of his kingdom. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Bishop Joseph Wandera. Right from Africa, we swiftly move to the heart of Asia now, and with that, I would like to invite Reverend Lillian Taroy to share with us. Reverend Lily, please.
Namaste to all of you. I take it as an honor to stand before you this afternoon. I am Lillian Taroy, coming from India, from the western part of India, northwest. I am an ordained minister in Diocese of Amritsar in Church of North India. Our diocese is working in 3 states, and all these 3 states are having their own religions, their own culture, and own language. Like I am in Punjab, where from Amritsar, you can see Archbishop, His Grace was there in Amritsar, and with some Sikh religious leaders, and at the background you see the Golden Temple. That is the world headquarters of the Sikhs. Many people call this temple, Golden Temple, as Baba Ki Ghar, that is Father's house. and they go there from different parts of the world. And there, people are mainly Sikhs, and they speak Punjabi and other languages also. And then there is the second state, that is Himachal Pradesh, where there are mostly Hindu people are there, and they speak Hindi and of course other languages, because part of Himalayas also is there, and so many hilly languages that will change the dialect in every 20 kilometers. And then there is Jammu Kashmir, another state that is top of the Indian map, and that is mainly Muslim area, and then they speak Kashmiri and of course other languages, and they have their own culture. And so this is a very different type of diocese where we come in contact with many different religions. And because of that, we have interfaith programs with them, and for interfaith programs, we have dialogues. But then we do not discuss our religions. We discuss the present issues like poverty, unemployment, substance abuse, gender discrimination, environment, and climate change. And there is one human platform which is called in Hindi Manav Manch that follows it up. Every year the bishop, he takes a peace bike rally, and then with the youth, and goes to different parts of the diocese and also other dioceses. Sometimes it was even 2,000 kilometers, sometimes it is on the plains, and sometimes it is on the Himalayan mountains. And then once, in one of our schools in Jammu Kashmir, that it was burnt by the Muslims. Because the news was one American, he threatened to burn Quran. And so they thought this is high time that we burn this missionary school. And they burnt it. And then, but in this school, the 100% students were Muslims. And they burned the Muslim schools. And inside that, they had also Qurans. And then the bishop took the peace bike rally of the youth and went to that place, and then met the people of different faith, had a interfaith discussions on peace. This school is part of a bigger school, and where there are 7,000 students, only 4 students are Christians. So the whole school is catering again mostly to the Muslims, and very few people who are Hindu and Sikhs. In whole of India, the best schools, colleges, and hospitals are established and run by the Christians. They cater to all, irrespective of their caste, creed, and religion. In Corona time, the diocese had provided shelter to more than once, it was 700 people, cooked food for 600 people. This went on for 6 months. It was for all people, Sikhs and Muslims and Christians and whoever was there. The people, they were all stranded. The migrant travelers were stranded there, and so the diocese, it provided food to all these people. Every day the diocesan workers cooked and packed and distributed food and water and sanitizers. Masks were also stitched by our own project people, and then they were distributed to all. And these masks had long bias there, so that the Sikh gentlemen on their turban, they could also tie it there. So it was, they were very happy to have this type of mask, not the mask that hooks our ears. The Sikh people, when they sanitized their Gurudwara, they also sanitized our church buildings. During this time when church buildings were, the Corona time, when the church buildings were all closed, diocese started rooftop services, because in Punjab, many houses are together and the roofs are all plain, flat. So people could come up to their roofs, on their own roofs. They cannot go to their other houses because it was all denied. prohibited, and so they could go up, and there were mics and there were worshippers on one of the roofs, and everybody could attend the rooftop services. And that was such a, it was like a revival conventions, and many people, whoever was in that area, they could hear, they could see, they could participate in that worship, Sikhs and Muslims and Christians and every one of them. There was also one Love in Action, that was a hotline for 24 hours. People from many parts of India, they phoned and we prayed with them, we counseled them, and also we gave them some financial help. There was a lecturer, one girl who phoned one day, she could not deal with the death of her father because he died in Corona. And then he phoned us, and then we organized counseling for that. Our diocesan staff, they consist of Sikhs and Hindus together with our Christian people. And we exchange greetings and cookies on religious festivals of our friends from other faith. And also, every one of them, they come, all of them, they come to our churches during festival time, during Christmas time, especially because it is very lighted and decorated, and also other Sundays, wherever there is already worship, they come and they pray, they ask us to pray for them. At the end of the day, it is not religion, it is the spirituality of the people. And all believe that there is one God. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reverend Lily. Archbishop, has England been always warm or hot as this? Because I think it is. And so before I invite Archbishop Nicholls to come and share with us, perhaps we would like to just stand up for a second to wake ourselves up. Yes, do what you need to do. Ah, yes, you feel good, I know. And you will feel better with Archbishop, the Primate of the Anglican Church in Canada, to speak to us. Please welcome her. Kindly be seated.
Very much for the welcome. I first want to thank Bishop Lillian for through her personal story, she has shared some of the complexities of interfaith relationships where political and social dynamics challenge them. Over the past 125 years, waves of immigrants and refugees have brought the religions of the world into Canada. Our large urban centers are highly multicultural and multi-faith. My landlord during my curacy was Muslim. Neighbors in my last parish were Orthodox Jews. And within a few kilometers of my home were a Zoroastrian temple, a mosque, several synagogues, and a Hindu temple. In recognition that loving our neighbor includes every neighbor near and far, it is essential to respect and understand the values and beliefs of those with whom we share our communities and our world. It is also essential to examine ourselves, to ask whether our own expressions of faith are consistent with the gospel and the call to hospitality. Christians have a long history of anti-Semitism in our relationship with our Jewish neighbors. From a too quick blaming of Jews for the crucifixion, to scapegoating of Jewish peoples in ways that contributed to the Holocaust, the Christian community is called to repentance. In Canada, Christian-Jewish dialogue has sometimes struggled as Christian communities seek to uphold partnerships with Christians in Palestine in the light of the actions of the State of Israel, yet also desire a relationship with Judaism that supports Jewish people in the face of recurring anti-Semitism and violence, both at home and abroad. In the face of strained relationships, the Anglican Church of Canada looked to our Book of Common Prayer. In 1992, we removed the third collect for Good Friday for the conversion of the Jews, recognizing that God has a particular and special relationship with the Jewish people through the Abrahamic covenant that is not ended by the coming of Jesus. However, we missed the opportunity to remove a similar prayer from the section of occasional prayers. At our General Synod in 2019, after careful preparation, in consultation with Jewish scholars and rabbis, a resolution to replace this prayer with a more appropriate one was proposed. We invited a local rabbi, Rabbi Adam Stein, to address the General Synod, which he did with humor, grace, and honesty. The first reading of the resolution passed easily. It will come for a second reading and hopefully final affirmation at our next General Synod in 2023. The prayer now reads, O God, who didst choose Israel to be thine inheritance, have mercy upon us and forgive us for violence and wickedness against our brother Jacob. The arrogance of our hearts and minds hath deceived us, and shame hath covered our face. Take away all pride and prejudice in us, and grant that we, together with the people whom thou didst first make thine own, may attain to the fullness of redemption which thou hast promised, to the honor and glory of thy most holy name. Amen. Rabbi Stein commented, I think it is such a wonderful thing and a really wonderful feeling for us that a prayer that certainly made the Jewish community feel uncomfortable might soon be replaced with one that's so beautiful and so positive. And Rabbi Ruben Pupko of Montreal, speaking on behalf of the Canadian Rabbinic Caucus, commended the Synod for its principal decision, which represents a milestone in Anglican Jewish relations, and further said, it has sent a strong signal to the Jewish community that it stands with us against anti-Semitism, both past and present. The photograph you see is the former Primate Archbishop Fred Hiltz greeting Rabbi Adam Stein. Extending hospitality to our neighbor requires us to offer respect and dignity, to be treated as we wish to be treated in all things, including freedom and safety, and recognized as part of the family of God in which all humanity shares. This is one small example of extending hospitality to an interfaith partner through self-examination, recognizing where our words and actions create barriers to welcome and sharing. As Bishop Gooley mentioned, another arena for direct cooperation is in actions for the common good of our communities. The needs of the homeless and poor cross all religious lines, inviting joint responses. Interfaith cooperation for housing projects, community gardens, and food banks extend hospitality through each other to the whole community. And they happen right across Canada, wherever people of faith choose to act together for the common good. Encounters in which we serve others deepen understanding and enrich our lives and help us to witness to the generous hospitality of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Linda. Now we go to the Holy Land, And I would like, with this, to invite the Archbishop of the Anglican province of Alexandria, Archbishop Samy Fawzy. We welcome him.
Well, thank you so much, Bishop Guli, for what you shared. You shared your life story with us. We're so proud of you as a fellow Middle Eastern. And your life and witness is a reflection of Jesus' great commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Interfaith relationship in Egypt. Egyptian society is a very religious society, for religion plays a very important role in the lives of Egyptians, both Muslims and Christians. The church and the mosque are the most important columns in the secular Egyptian society and cannot be separated from it. Egyptians lived in pluralistic society for 15 centuries, with all its joys and pains. Therefore, dialogue and interfaith relations is of paramount importance for all Egyptians. This led us to establish the new Christian-Muslim Partnership and Study Center in April 2022. The first center of its kind in any of the churches in Egypt. If we apply the four principles of dialogue on the interfaith relation in Egypt, first, dialogue begins when people meet people and proceeds in terms of people of other faiths meeting each other. Rather than theoretical impersonal systems, it is a live dialogue that takes place between neighbors and friends. Our relationship with God and our mission to the world cannot be separated from our relationship to our neighbor. My neighbor's faith and mine in the society of today do not simply coexist. They interact and correlate. Culture centers in Cairo and Alexandria are instrumental in bringing literally hundreds of young Muslims and Christian youth from age 18 to 25 to share in cultural activities within the church walls. Arts, music, poetry, and drama. Dialogue depends upon mutual understanding and trust. This involves meeting people, listening carefully to their account of faith, and sharing with them an account of our faith. We live in a situation of permanent dialogue. We share the same land, we share the same history, and we share the same destiny. The daily encounter of Christians with Islam has greatly affected our theological outlook, our values and traditions, and our understanding of ourselves. Dialogue as an exchange of information about each other religion, though it is valuable, does not seem very important in Egypt. However, the understanding and interpretation of religion does change with contemporary economic, religious, political, and social challenges. This dialogue is a formal dialogue between Muslims and Christian leaders. It is common to find pictures of Muslims and Christian leaders together on the pages of the newspapers. And this removes barriers of misinterpretation and misunderstanding in the society in general. Religious institutions have a major role to play in reaching a common mind in crucial issues relating to the Christian community. Such issues as citizenship in an Islamic society, the right to reach senior positions in government, assurance of no persecution, and the freedom to build new churches. Beit al-Aila, House of the Family, is an example of this principle of dialogue. It provides a unique opportunity of dialogue. Forum provides encounter and fellowship between Christians and Muslim leaders. Third, Dialogue makes it possible to share in service within community. This dialogue seeks to build the community. It is people from different faiths meeting together to address common problems. The church's entire existence is shaped by its living among Muslims. We need a coherent and relevant theology to make us more reliable partners with our neighbors in our common mission of community building. New theology that is strong enough to allow mutual witness, at the same time resist any temptation to possible compromise. Our mission is apparent. It is a call to renewal of the entire human community. It is essentially the transformation of human beings, community, and the whole creation. Initiative as together we develop Egypt and planting a tree of hope allow partnership in creating harmony in society. Seminars, workshops by religious leaders on how to live together to diffuse tension in villages in Upper Egypt when we take young people from very difficult places to our hospitals and schools and give them 2-3 weeks of education of Muslims and Christians can live together in harmony. Fourth and last, dialogue becomes the means of authentic witness if we enter dialogue with a firm commitment to our faith. Time again, dialogue gives opportunity for authentic witness. In this kind of dialogue, there is possibility of an authentic witness and a spiritual encounter. In mutual respect, each can testify to his or her own faith without fear of prejudice, each religion having the opportunity to define its own beliefs more clearly, which results in a clearer mutual understanding. This distinctiveness of each religion must be acknowledged and respected. Any attempt to understand or evaluate it from the standpoint of another tradition has to be rejected. In concluding, the question concerning faith in Egypt becomes, how strong is our relationship? In order to increase the bond of fellowship and mutual understanding, there is a need for dialogue on all levels, personal, formal, to reach point of acceptance of the reality that there are differences and there are points of mutual agreement. This kind of dialogue needs to be formed and progressed from both religions. Thank you so much for listening.
We wish to once again thank our panelists, and especially our keynote speaker, Bishop Guli, Bishop Joseph, Reverend Lily, Archbishop Linda, and Archbishop Sammy. We truly appreciate your sharing, and I am sure each and every one of us would have our own stories and challenges as well. For all these, we give thanks and praise to God and ask that He will continue to lead and guide us. It is 3:40. We must be kind to ourselves. Therefore, let us all stand and give thanks to God as we say our closing prayer. And I will lead you in this prayer as I invite you to say it together. Let us pray. Generous God, you are life, life that gives itself, returns upon itself, and pours itself out afresh. God, the Holy Trinity, you have made us in your image. Help us to live with generosity and commitment, and our sobriety too. May our praise and thanksgiving be shown not only with our lips, but in our lives, through our time, our purses, our skills, and our prayers. Amen. Amen. Friends, thank you so very much for your attention and participation. God bless.
Thank you very much to Bishop Danald and to everybody else as they leave the stage for another wonderful plenary. One of the ways that we express our communion as the Anglican Communion is through link dioceses. If you are not linked to another diocese and would like to be, please visit the Anglican Communion stand in the Resources Centre, who are compiling a list to try and pair any diocese wanting this. This evening, for all those from South Sudan who are travelling on to Salisbury Diocese after the conference, there will be a short meeting after evening prayer here in Venue 1 at 6:45. So that's South Sudan people who are going to Salisbury, 6:45 in here for a short meeting. Bishops, we will see you back here at 4:15 for the Lambeth calls on both Christian unity and interfaith relations. And spouses, please do enjoy your strengthening sessions. Thank you all.
Welcome back, everybody. We'll just take a few minutes while a few more people get into the room. We're going to start with Christian unity, so you might want to refresh your memory on the call on Christian unity while we're waiting for the room to populate.